This is what Europe might have looked like in the 1920s, and how Germany captured Paris at the end of 2014. The Schlieffen Plan achieved its goal, but this might not have happened if Russia had not attacked Galicia and East Prussia, diverting German forces from the Western Front. I also want to touch on the risk of invasion in the Netherlands. According to my survey, 75% of you believe that France would have surrendered if Paris had been captured at the end of 2014 or the beginning of 2015. Delving into the details, people agree that France would not have capitulated immediately after losing Paris. The French government was already planning during the Great War to move its capital to Bordeaux and continue from there. One can confidently say that if Paris is lost, France will try to reclaim it, and only upon failure will it ultimately capitulate. Allow me to show you what I proposed, and I'm starting a new series, so expect more episodes on this topic. We all know how the Great War, also known as World War I, began with the assassination of the Archduke in Bosnia by a Serb, which led Russia to declare war on Germany. Germany found itself on two fronts, aiming to quickly remove France from the war and then focus on Russia to win the Great War. Instead of quick success on the Western Front, we faced trench warfare, meaning neither side could advance without losing hundreds of thousands. All of this could have been prevented, and Germany could have won the Great War if they had captured Paris, which they almost did, historically stopping 30 kilometers from the city. Artillery fire on the front was heard in Paris, so the war was at the doorstep of the French capital. The first option for Germany to capture Paris was to go through the Netherlands, which was a high-risk, high-reward move. Germany had good relations with the Dutch and preferred to trade with them throughout the war, so attacking its only trading partner was not the wisest move. However, at the beginning of the war, there was no certainty that it would be a long war, and most thought it would end by Christmas. So the mood was not for a prolonged conflict, and Germany's invasion of the Netherlands seemed possible. Let me remind you that in retrospect, it would have been a very bad idea. This plan is not very realistic and does not guarantee the fall of Paris. But let's briefly consider it. The advantage of attacking the Netherlands is that Germany can use its modern railways, allowing for faster transportation of troops and equipment. Given that their plan depended on speed, capturing Paris was possible by attacking through the Netherlands. On the other hand, of course, if the Netherlands puts up more resistance than expected, which is almost guaranteed, the Germans will face even greater problems, which will only worsen their situation. I would say this is a high-risk, high-reward scenario. Either Germany captures Paris or suffers defeat. If Germany attacked the Netherlands and somehow, if the Germans had been successful against their opponents, they could have won World War I just 6 months after it began. This is the most optimistic scenario, but it is more likely that the Germans would suffer defeat even faster. The attack on the Netherlands should be considered separately, and I plan to make a video on this topic in the near future. If you are interested, subscribe to not miss it. Another option for Germany to capture Paris is that Austria-Hungary shows a bit more competence, or Russia proves to be more effective in the war. However, it is more likely that Germany will decide to leave East Prussia and focus on more defensive positions, which will halve their front with the Russians and require fewer soldiers to hold the lines. This will allow more soldiers to remain in Western Europe instead of being sent to the Eastern Front. This is yet another risky but potentially profitable scenario that could end catastrophically for Germany, as Austria-Hungary may lose much territory and capitulate. Alternatively, everything could go perfectly for the Central Powers, and Germany could capture Paris with additional forces. In any case, this is possible, as this scenario is also very risky. And according to the title of the video, I will use the option in which Germany successfully captures Paris. There are many possibilities for this, and I have already mentioned two of the most interesting and plausible ways. Of course, there are other scenarios in which Belgium somehow becomes an ally, promising it French lands in Europe and Africa, but that is too unlikely. Belgium was artificially created as a neutral country at Britain's initiative, and its capitulation to the Germans would have led to war earlier than in July. Nevertheless, the possibilities are limitless. But I want to choose the option where Germany and Austria-Hungary lose part of their territories to Russia and do not send additional forces to strengthen the region. Instead, Austria will focus on Serbia, while Germany will focus on France and Belgium. I think this will create a more interesting scenario, but you can use any of the suggested alternatives that you believe are most plausible for capturing Paris. So, if the Germans somehow capture Paris, what happens next? We can assume that the French government has already moved to Bordeaux and will continue the war from there, but the return of Paris will be their main goal. French soldiers will lose much of their fighting spirit after the loss of the capital, but the war will continue nonetheless. Italy is likely to remain neutral in this conflict, but we'll see Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire quickly join the Central Powers. This will lead to a quicker capitulation of Serbia, and the Eastern Front will stabilize. In other respects, World War I continues and unfolds almost as it did historically. The French will try to reclaim Paris, reminiscent of the Germans' plans in 1916. Historically, in 1916, due to trench warfare, the Germans planned to force the British and French to attack them, thereby exhausting their forces, the resources that could give the Germans the numerical superiority they hoped for, leading to a breakthrough. I am sure that Wilhelm II learned this strategy while playing Hearts of Fire and 4. Historically, Germany attempted to capture Verdun, starting a battle for it that lasted almost 10 months. The Germans hoped that if they could take Verdun, which had symbolic significance for France, the French would try to reclaim it at any cost, losing hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the process. This almost happened, but Germany was never able to fully capture Verdun. The Battle of the Somme was initiated by France and Britain to divert Germany and draw forces away from Verdun. 1916 turned out to be very bloody on the Western Front. Why am I telling you all this? Because the capture of Paris by Germany at the end of 1914 or the beginning of 1915 would have been very similar to these events. Just as the French wanted to defend Verdun, they would have defended Paris as well. Germany would hardly be able to capture the city immediately, so it would have to besiege and possibly encircle it. The entire process of capturing Paris would take 1 to 2 months, but I am simplifying. When Germany inevitably captures Paris, it can be expected that France and Britain will launch a similar offensive, comparable in scale to the Battle of the Somme. This battle was colossal in scale and lasted 4 months, involving more than 3 million soldiers on both sides. It was France's last attempt to win the war. There is an opinion that if France cannot reclaim Paris, it will have to sign a separate peace agreement. You might say that it is much more likely that France will be able to reclaim Paris for various reasons. But if that happens, we will move to a historical scenario, and nothing will change. Even if what I am about to say seems unrealistic, it creates a more interesting scenario. If you truly believe that by capturing Paris, the Germans will simply leave it behind, then nothing will change in the scale of the Great War. The peace treaty may be a bit harsher for Germany, but that's all. In this alternative timeline, the French will attempt their final counterattack, but will fail. This is related to the fact that the French army in 1914 and 1915 still used bright blue uniforms, making them an easy target for German artillery. Moreover, the most industrially developed region of France was located in the northeast, which is now almost entirely captured by the Germans. Of course, the Mediterranean part of France still retains wealth, but it cannot claim a complete victory for the French at that moment. Probably, the war of attrition and trench warfare will benefit the Germans. Wilhelm II has achieved his goal of eliminating France as a potential enemy, and now he can safely redirect his forces to the Eastern Front. Considering that the Central Powers are winning, Italy may decide to join this faction only to secure. The situation in North Africa and Tunisia is unlikely, as the Italians prefer to unite with the Entente and seize Austrian lands. However, let me explain my logic. Italy can either wait out this war, gaining nothing, or at the last moment join what they consider the winners and acquire some land without much effort, despite existing disagreements. I think it would be reasonable for Italy to join this conflict on the side of the Central Powers around mid-1915. Even if I'm wrong, the Italians are unlikely to do anything. They will either stay in the Austrian Alps or the French ones, so nothing will significantly change in the global scale of the war. Now you may wonder why Germany doesn't capture all of France. I don't think the Germans would take such a step, even if they found themselves in a similar situation. If Germany decided to conquer all of France before moving to the Eastern Front, it would certainly weaken their military efforts. Despite the fact that the Germans outnumber the French, the latter had about 40 million people. This means that to conquer all of France, the Germans would have to control and temporarily govern 40 million people, which, in my opinion, does not seem appealing to the German command if they found themselves in such a situation. Germany will likely focus on the northeastern part of France, which was the richest in the country, and as a result, France will cease to be a threat. At this stage, France will either capitulate to Germany or, more likely, continue the fight but become equal in strength to the Italians, which will not pose a serious problem for Germany. I have no doubt that Britain will send soldiers and reinforcements, but considering that the richest parts of France are already conquered, the front lines will be significantly changed. Speaking of France in 1915, let me show you the French coins used during the Great War. This is a 5-sou coin from 1916, which was used during the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Verdun. There is a possibility that this coin was carried by a soldier who participated in these battles. On the other hand, I have 10 ses from 1917, and this coin was also used during the war. Both coins have a rich history behind them, and it's nice to be able to touch something from that time. Returning to our topic, the Germans are significantly weakening France and are now moving east, where Russia is in danger. I think it can be said with confidence that the Russians have no chance, and the Bolshevik Revolution may happen a year earlier. The Provisional Government and the subsequent Russian Civil War are very complex topics, so for simplicity, I will greatly simplify. The Germans will still send Lenin to St. Petersburg, Petrograd, and the financing of its communist cause hope for the collapse of Russia due to instability. This becomes increasingly likely as bread prices rise in Russia, and this time the Russians cannot rely on Western aid, remaining completely alone with their problems. If Nicholas II does not sign a separate peace treaty with the Central Powers, a civil war will likely begin in Russia, in which the Bolsheviks will probably win. For the purposes of this video, I want to make some assumptions to make it more interesting. Firstly, I don't think Romania will enter this war, as it joined the conflict only in 1916 due to a successful Russian attack on Austria-Hungary. Such a successful Russian offensive in an alternate history will not happen, so Romania's neutrality will likely be ensured. Believe it or not, I will make Nicholas II sign a separate peace treaty, as a result of which he will lose the Baltics, Poland, Finland, and parts of Ukraine. This humiliating world will be necessary and requested by the Russian population. Nevertheless, Nicholas II may lose power, and we may witness events similar to the February Revolution, which led to the appointment of Alexander Kinin as the temporary governor of Russia. Although this will be considered temporary, it will soon become clear that his government will strengthen its position and blame the Romanovs for Russia's defeat in the war. As for Germany, it will effectively win this war, which will last about 2 years, instead of 4. This means that the United States of America and the Republic of China will not enter into conflict. However, Portugal and Japan may still join the Entente in 1915 or 1916, but the war will already be won by Germany. And although it is interesting to mention them, these countries will not be able to change the course of events. Now let me examine in detail the peace treaty in which the Central Powers won, starting with my homeland, Bulgaria. It will receive its claims on parts of Serbia, including all of Macedonia and the Nish province. Greece and Romania, as I mentioned, did not enter this war, but the situation with Greece is even more interesting. Historically, the Greeks joined the Great War in the summer of 1917, so in this alternative history, the war has already ended. This means that the Greeks took too long to choose a side and did not participate in the conflict. I expect Germany to grant them Cyprus and possibly some territories from Albania as a reward for their neutrality. This was supposedly a proposal made by the Germans to Greece, as the Greeks would gain lands in the event of a Central Powers victory. I expect Greece and Bulgaria to improve their relations by ending mutual territorial claims over Thrace and Macedonia. The relations between the two countries will normalize and improve. Speaking of Bulgaria, I think there is a possibility to return southern Dobruja, if not all of Dobruja, as Romania will receive its rewards. As for what was once Russian Bessarabia, I believe it is a fair exchange with Bulgaria. They may gain a bit more, but I will let them take advantage of these benefits for the sake of completing the video about the Balkans. Serbia and Montenegro will find themselves in a difficult position as they become Austrian vassal states, and Austria will seize the Montenegrin coast, especially the city of Kotor. As for the Eastern Front, we can expect Germany to dominate all these regions, with Wilhelm II's brother effectively becoming the King of Finland. The situation with Poland will be similar, as it historically became a kingdom from 1919 to 1918, but a king was never elected. This time we can see another German noble becoming the King of Poland, and Ukraine is likely to also become a monarchy, probably with a representative of the Habsburg dynasty on the throne. Despite this, Germany will still retain significant influence in the new state, as the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph IV will die in 1916, and the reformist King Charles V will ascend to the throne, able to implement reforms in Austria-Hungary. Moreover, the country will not be at war, so his reforms will be implemented immediately, benefiting the region. The Caucasus may very well transition to the Ottoman Empire, considering the situation with the Armenians. The Ottomans are likely to receive British territories on the Arabian Peninsula, but the Suez Canal will be a complex challenge. The British will probably continue to fight, trying to hold the canal, so it will not be handed over to the Ottomans. As for Western Europe, the Germans will seize many territories from France and annex Luxembourg. Part of French lands will be given to Belgium, and the country will cease to be neutral, supported by Britain, and will become an ally of the Germans, with another representative of the House of Hohenzollern in power. France will lose Corsica and Tunisia to Italy, greatly satisfying the Italians. British Malta and Gibraltar are also likely to pass to Italy and Spain respectively. Overall, Western Europe will not lose important European lands, and it will be more inclined to agree to these peace conditions. As for Africa, I see that Germany is reforming its colonies, connecting Cameroon with Namibia and Tanzania, while Kenya and Uganda are likely to become German as well, allowing Germany to border Italy in Africa, which includes Italian Somalia. Finally, in the peace agreement, France, Britain, and Russia will owe a significant sum to the Central Powers, and these countries will be blamed for starting the war. This will have several consequences, which I will describe right now. This may seem to you like a Kaiser War from the game Hearts of Iron 4, but in reality, it is a completely different situation. The world will likely be more interesting than in Kaiser for several reasons. Firstly, since the war lasted only 2 years, it is unlikely that Germany will experience an economic collapse, which means no Great Depression. Secondly, France and Britain are unlikely to become communist, and their governments will not be forced to flee to Canada. French colonies, like in the Kaiser era, can expect that the governments of these countries will initiate a Second World War. However, this time, there is one important difference. Italy did not fall apart, but instead thrived, uniting with the Central Powers at the last moment after the fall of Paris, which allowed it to seize light territories. Austria-Hungary may reorganize under the rule of Charles I, likely becoming known as the United States of Europe. This is what the new European order will look like with the victorious Central Powers. But all this will soon change. For example, immediately after the Great War, Britain was on the rise in our timeline, despite winning the war. This time, however, Britain clearly suffered defeat, and we can assume that the war for Irish independence will be even more successful. Despite being part of a series, you can still watch this episode and see how post-war society will develop. The exact borders remain open to interpretation, as if Germany had won in 1918. The borders would be different and stricter, mainly in the east. In this scenario, I want to explore the post-war period when Austria-Hungary is under the rule of Charles I, the first reforming king who will begin transforming the empire into the United States of Central Europe. Russia will also be reformed, but in the opposite direction. Let me show how the world will shape before this alternative World War II. I will briefly mention the Irish War of Independence, which was historically won by Ireland and began in 1919, ending in 1921. There are two sides to this story, as historically Britain was occupied with securing its interests in the Ottoman lands during the Turkish War of Independence and also dealt with the Hungarian Soviet Republic. Thus, it can be said that the British army was very busy and scattered around the world. This time, when Britain suffered defeat in the war, there will be no war for the independence of Turkey and the Hungarian Soviet Republic, which will lead to the return of British soldiers home. As a result, it may be more likely that Britain will win the conflict against Ireland militarily, but I do not think the British will benefit from this move. Historically, in the year 1916, when the uprising occurred in Dublin, the Irish people rose against British rule, but the Irish were defeated after a week of fighting. Many believe that the uprising was one of the least organized, so it could not be successful, regardless of whether Britain won World War I. I will take this event as a basis, and at the moment Britain will suppress the first and initial Irish uprising, but this does not guarantee Britain's position on the island in the future. Ireland may rise again later, but for now, I believe the most likely outcome is the suppression of the Irish. Nevertheless, life in Ireland will be tense, as the Irish will not support the British, and now their country will be paying reparations to Germany for World War I, leading to the impoverishment of the Irish population. The burden of repaying the main part of the debt will fall on the average Irishman, meaning he will pay and be taxed more than the average Englishman. This will lead to several consequences, as hatred towards the British Empire will continue to grow on the Irish island. As for British politics, nothing will change in the country. It will remain a kingdom under the rule of George V. Nevertheless, people will radicalize under the influence of propaganda and seek revenge. The British economy will be on the brink of collapse, and they will be heavily indebted to Germany, so such initiatives will not appear anytime soon. At that time, there were two main parties in British politics. In the elections of 1910, Conservatives and Liberal Unionists received 46.6% of the votes, while their opponents, the Liberals, got 44.2%. The remaining votes were distributed among small political parties, but it is worth noting the Labour Party, which received 6.4% of the votes. I expect the Labour Party to gain significantly more votes, possibly even up to 15%, mainly at the expense of the Conservatives. This is important since Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher were representatives of this party. The Conservative Party will lose popularity after Britain's defeat in the Great War. We may not see Winston Churchill rise to power, as the Conservatives will lose popularity for supporting the war even before Germany invaded Belgium, while the Liberals wanted it only afterward. I think the Conservative Party will suffer another blow and lose 10% of the votes, which will go to the Liberals, who will thus secure 54.2% and ensure themselves a majority. Britain is not yet ready for radicalization. The elections will take place in 1918. In this scenario, Britain has not lost much on the continent and has only lost a few colonies in Africa. The British are still not the majority against Germany, and there are factions supporting neutrality in the European wars. In fact, these factions are more popular than those seeking revenge. This is explained by the fact that Britain entered the war only because Serbia was attacked by Austria and Belgium by Germany, and neither of these events concerned Britain's interests. Thus, the British would lean towards neutrality and turn away from France. As for the French, their politics will become extremely complicated. France was already a republic with free elections, but due to the defeat in the Great War, new parties will emerge. In 1916, there will be extraordinary elections, just 2 years after the elections of 1914, where the Republican Unionist Party won. If we look at the election results of 1914, no party received more than 19% of the votes. To secure a majority of 51%, the parties will have to work together in a coalition, including at least 3 major parties. Even then, France seems very radical and leftist, as seen in the names of their political parties: Republican Unionist, Radical Republican, and Radical Socialist Party. In this scenario, we observe the political situation in Europe against the backdrop of France's potential loss in the Great War. Historically, in 1914, about 28% of voters supported leftist or radical parties. If France loses, it is likely to become a socialist country rather than an ultra-nationalist one. For simplicity, I will combine most political parties into one. We will have a Republican front that will secure 51% of the votes, ensuring a narrow majority. The left parties will also unite in the People's Front, receiving 28% of the votes. Independent radicals will remain an independent political force with 16% of the votes. The remaining votes will be given to a new political party called French Renaissance, which will be ultra-nationalistic and focus on restoring France as a global power, ending hostilities, and reclaiming lost territories. In 1916, this party will receive only 5% of the votes, but I expect its influence to grow over time. Their goal will be to unite all French-speaking people under one banner, including French-speaking residents of Switzerland, as well as to create buffer states around France so that Paris and France itself are never captured again. As for Germany, no changes in policy are expected. Emperor Wilhelm II will remain in power and become even more popular. German culture will be seen as superior as Germany achieves a new victory over France. Economically, the war was costly for Germany, but not as much as one might assume. A brief period of stagnation is expected, but reparations from the former enemy will help the German economy. Politically, Germany will be centrist and increasingly conservative. I don't think they will start to liberalize after the victory, but perhaps I am mistaken. As for the United States of America, they still remain the largest economy in the world, but are not interested in European affairs. Furthermore, Americans did not participate in the Great War, as it ended too quickly. They will likely remain neutral and isolationist, but will strive for hegemony in North and South America, preventing the influence of Germany and Britain in this region. In our reality, the United States briefly occupied Haiti and the Dominican Republic for various reasons irrelevant to this scenario. It is important that this brief occupation will become somewhat more permanent as American soldiers begin to build military bases on the island of Haiti. In the east, several countries separated from Russia, including Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Finland. Speaking of the Baltics, Russia. Alexander Kinsky, leading his troops, seeks to reclaim territories as Russians desire any possible victory. Life in Russia during that period will be especially hard. Bread prices will rise and inflation will reach threatening levels. Moreover, Russia must pay reparations to the Central Powers, which will further impoverish the country and its people. That is why Kinsky intends to invade the Baltics to achieve at least a partial victory. If he remains inactive, he he is likely to lose his power. Moreover, since the Russian army is no longer involved in the Great War, the soldiers risk radicalizing and rising up against Kinsky and his provisional government. Considering that these soldiers have military training and equipment, it is important for the Qin government to support war veterans in any way possible. Otherwise, they may turn against it. To occupy the veterans, Kinsky will send them to the front against the Baltic countries with the aim of either winning and achieving a better peace, or losing a significant number of soldiers and signing a comprehensive peace treaty. In any case, this will be beneficial for Kinsky and his government, as if 100,000 Russian soldiers die, that is 100,000 fewer who can participate in the uprising against his rule. Thus, Kinsky will create a win-win situation, as this war will not hold serious significance for him. The Russian regime will prefer to send future protesters to certain death. One might argue that this is unlikely, but it is worth reminding that after the end of the Great War, many other conflicts began. I have already mentioned the Irish War of Independence, the Turkish War of Independence, and the Hungarian Soviet Republic, which sparked numerous wars. Germany was also in chaos. Bavaria was trying to become communist and declared war on both Germany and Switzerland. There was a civil war in Russia, followed by the Soviet-Polish War, and these were just the main conflicts in Europe. Returning to our chronological context, it would be naive to believe that the post-war period would be free of conflicts and that life would be peaceful. In the early years after the end of the Great War, in the year 2016, much instability is expected. Russia will find itself in a favorable position, as the Baltic states will be weaker. Initially, the Russian invasion will be successful, but of course, the Germans will inevitably appear and take the upper hand. Russia will suffer enormous losses, but it is important to remember that they are fighting against states, each with a population of several million. These countries have just gained independence. Russian troops will be near the capital of Estonia, Revel, which will later be renamed Tallinn, and will also capture Daugavpils. This happens because the Russians aim to maximize chaos and approach Lithuania by attacking it. As mentioned, Kinsky is aware of the German intervention, and it will not come as a surprise to him. He fully understood that the Russian soldiers were embarking on a suicidal mission, but this did not frighten him. Even worse was that thousands of Russian soldiers received orders from their generals to hold the fourth city of Tevel as the Germans began to arrive in large numbers. As Russia began to liberalize and open up, at least on paper, a partial freedom of the press was soon to emerge. Stories of Russia's impending defeat in the Baltic would reach the people and provoke anger. This is why Nicholas II and the Russian royal family will likely be placed under house arrest and stripped of their titles, while their property and assets will be confiscated. Alexander Kinsky hoped that this news would make headlines rather than the defeat awaiting the Russian Empire. As I mentioned, the Russian army will be forced to hold the city of Tevel, which will lead to the city's encirclement by the Germans. Although this will come as a surprise, Alexander Kinsky will be glad to see fewer future protesters. And the time to address the issue with the Romanovs will be just right. The Russian royal family will be accused of starting the Great War, and the symbols of royal power will be removed from every building and currency. Coins like this 1 ruble from 1824, which will be exactly 200 years old in 2024, will be melted down, and the silver used for military operations as well as for producing new coins. Nevertheless, the Russian soldiers will suffer defeat in Tver, and soon the provisional government will seek a white peace. Public discontent in Russia will not be significant, as the provisional government will secure a deal for cheap export of Ukrainian grain to the people of Russia, alleviating their bread crisis. This can be compared to the Winter War, when the Soviet Union clearly lost, but Soviet propaganda tried to present it as a victory. The Russian provisional government and Alexander Kinsky will be able to declare victory, as they managed to force the Germans to sell them grain at a low price. This is far from the truth, as the Germans would prefer to quickly end the conflict to strengthen their power over the new states. In the previous episode, I mentioned that the Germans would send Lenin to St. Petersburg anyway, but you might wonder where the communist revolution is. Historically, Lenin arrived in Russia on April 16, 1917, but in this timeline, the war had already ended by that time, yet Lenin is still in the city or hiding in Finland. This is significant because now Lenin and the Bolsheviks will not start a civil war. The reason for their historical success was that they were able to use the ongoing war, promising peace and bread to everyone. Now the Bolsheviks cannot promise as much and quickly gain support. Nevertheless, among them, there are still communists ready to act. Revolutionary ideas in Russia will not lead to civil war at this time, unlike in history. In my opinion, Without the ongoing Great War, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, for the Bolsheviks to form a government. Although a civil war initiated by the Bolsheviks is theoretically possible, it will not happen in the near future. At the moment, Russia is stabilizing and improving its situation. The flag of the Provisional Government of Russia will look like this. I assume that the total population will be 34,200,000 people, and the temporary ruler will be Alexander Kinsky. The gross domestic product per capita will be $800, which corresponds to the level of 20 years ago, at the beginning of the 2000s. This is almost half of what it was before the war. It is quite possible that Moscow will become the new capital, as St. Petersburg is close to the Finnish border, which is an ally of Germany. Moreover, it was the capital of the Romanovs, and Kinsky will likely want to make changes. As for the Baltic states, these countries have just been captured by Russia, and they, along with Germany, realize the need for unification. This unification will